Hello and welcome to this book chat with Shadow Mountain Publishing and my dear friend, amazing author, Heather Moore. I am so excited.
How are you doing? It's so good to see you online, of course.
I know. I feel like sometimes we think we know what's happening in each other's lives, but
Right.
it's nice to have a real conversation. And I'm so excited. I love doing author interviews because I'm an author. And so I just feel like I think we understand each other's heart and what it takes to birth a book. That's what I always
Yes.
feel is it's a birthing process. And it is a part of our souls that walk around on pages. And you are one of the most brilliant authors. And I love the genre you specialize in because it's not my genre. So I don't imagine conversations as beautifully as you do. And I love historical fiction and historical nonfiction. And I just feel like, and anything World War II. So you checked all the boxes before we even started talking.
Well, thank you. And I agree because it is fun to get to know other authors and to read what they write because we're not all writing the same thing and that just makes everything richer.
Yeah, I agree. And I love that we all have different voices, but I kind of want to start with, you had some great success with your previous book, Under the Java Moon. This is a little bit different timestamp, but what made you decide to kind of still lean into this historical framework in telling stories?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I have read a lot of World War II fiction and stories set in the era. And I remember thinking to myself, I'll never write something set in World War II because there's so much out there. There's so much expertise and so many things that take place like in Europe. And I feel like a lot of those stories have been told, or maybe I'm not the right person to tell them. But then when I was in a meeting with my publisher, they were talking about bringing up stories that maybe are lesser told.
Mhm.
And so that's how something like Under the Java Moon came about, since that's set in Indonesia. And I was able to interview a prisoner of war survivor and find out what her and her family went through. But Lady Fire was a little bit different. Like we still wanted to do the World War II era, but we wanted to do more of a point of view from those that were in America, in the United States, that didn't go overseas into combat, but stayed in the United States and found ways to serve in the war. And so that kind of led to women aviators, because as we know, women didn't fly in combat. And then it just led to brainstorming, okay, which women should we talk about? And Nancy Love was kind of in the top 3 out of everything. And then she ended up winning out, I guess.
Well, you kind of segued perfectly into one of my questions, which was the fact that I've consumed a lot of World War II content over the years, from books to movies to, museums, right?
Yeah.
Anything around that era, I feel like I'm hungry for. But I think I was talking about this with Rebecca when I was talking with her about her book, that I love that in the last few years, it feels like these untold stories of World War II are coming to the surface. Like we're getting conversations about people that played some key roles, but haven't been given the platform, so to speak. And so I love that you intentionally sought out those untold stories. And every time I hear a different version, like I recently watched a series about one of the Holocaust survivors that was the tattoo artist, right? And anytime I hear all of a sudden this different version, or someone that lived in France and never was, and was doing a totally different thing than I have heard said or shared,
Right.
or previewed, I feel like, of course, it's not like this myopic view of the war. And why were we only telling maybe certain stories? Because war affects families
Everyone. Yeah.
and people that don't go into combat. And so I love that you specifically are fleshing out another aspect or layer that I think informs what maybe some of our grandparents or others that still remember.
Right.
It opens conversations. So what did you learn about World War II that maybe you didn't know going in, other than you knew you were going to try to find a story that hadn't been highlighted?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously learned a lot. It's amazing how you can keep learning about the war, even though, like you said, we've been to the museums, we've watched the films, we've read the books. I thought it was just really remarkable how this group of women who became the WASP, the Women Air Force Service pilots, um, there were women in America and across the world. We know that the Soviet actually had a female squadron of pilots that did fly combat, and then uh, the British Royal Air Force, they had also women that flew for them, but they would ferry planes to the air bases. So they were basically transport pilots. And so these American pilots were seeing what was going on throughout the world because obviously the war started, globally before the United States jumped in after Pearl Harbor. So they're like a couple years in there where all these women pilots were like, we can help, we can do things. Our country's not letting us do things. And so I didn't realize how so many women had been preparing and were skilled flyers. I think it was a couple thousand actually applied for this program, but they accepted like around 1,100. And so, and some of them came with just tons of experience. They were training men to fly. In fact, I live in Utah, and I went to Hill Air Force Base, and they have a museum attached to it. And I remember walking around, I think, okay, I need like a real expert to read these flying scenes. Someone that is a retired Air Force, because someone that maybe they didn't fly the exact plane, but they'd probably be more familiar than a pilot today. And so I just walked around, I talked to all these Air Force vets, and one guy offered to read my scenes. And he and the other guy who's standing with her, like just volunteers at the museum, they had both been trained by women WASP that were in the WASP. And
Wow.
so women didn't have a lot of places to fit as far as flying. But especially when Pearl Harbor happened, all these men there, I mean, some men had already volunteered and left, but there's all more and more men were volunteering and joining the Air Force and training and going into combat. And so it left this huge void of transporting planes. And so when the women flyers were finally approved, there's a lot of red tape to go through. In fact, Nancy Love, who's the main character of this book, she and a couple of other female aviators, they spent 2 years before they got approved, trying to get through the red tape, trying to get approval. And they kept being told, no, 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 and so when so they had laid all the groundwork. And so if they hadn't laid the groundwork, then there would have been a huge deficit as far as trying to get all these bombers that were being manufactured, because everything was accelerated. Suddenly
Mhm.
America's in the war. Suddenly we need all this manpower and all these planes. And the women were there. They trained on them. In fact, Nancy Love, she flew. She was the first woman to fly some of these really big bombers. She was the first woman to fly the P-51 Mustang, and she was more of a director of the program, so she wasn't doing the actual ferrying, but she went to train on all of them so that she could say, okay, I did it. You guys can all do it now. And then they had women that would, be in certain squadrons or train on certain planes.
So I have so many questions. I have not finished the book, but I'm not a spoiler when I tell you that right at the beginning in the introduction, you share kind of how the end is going to show up before we get to the end. And that
Mhm.
is, everything isn't fixed. Like, women aren't all of a sudden like embraced and
Right.
involved, and they've checked, they've presented themselves in a way that shows how capable they are, and now all of a sudden the system has changed and they're integrated. So
Yeah.
you say that from the front end, that like you're going to get to the end and still be somewhat
Mhm.
frustrated for these characters because it doesn't fix everything. And I just wanted to share two thoughts. One is, I just finished a book about the women, if you've read it,
Yeah.
about women in Vietnam. And so if you fast forward from World War II to Vietnam, these were nursing women, but the nurses weren't, people still years later, when the Vietnam Memorial was being built, still thought women were not in Vietnam. And so I
Right.
felt like juxtaposition, you go to the 70s and there was still this sense of like, we don't know these stories of women. And then you have a daughter that's a pilot. And so I think what a
Mhm.
beautiful awareness and gift to give her, even though by the end of this book, everything's not fixed. And by the time
Right.
Vietnam happens, it's not all fixed, right? Like there's still, what do you feel about the idea of giving a platform for women's voices and women's stories? And what are your thoughts in general about letting the reader know from the onset, you're not going to get to the end of this and there's going to be this glorious change per
Right.
se.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, the glorious change doesn't take place until finally, in the 1970s, when women are allowed to fly for the Air Force and they're recognized as members of the military. But it's interesting that you bring that up, because those things wouldn't happen unless all of these other things happen, unless all of
Right.
this, the glass ceiling was broken, and a lot of it, has to go from gender roles, very traditional gender roles. And in fact, there was a requirement to just come and apply to be a WASP, but then you had to like fly, and you had to pass some of the flying tests, but you had to be 35 or under, and that was because they thought women, and this is just from like bureaucracy, I don't know where it came from, but women start menopause at 35. Who knew? And so we can't
I
test
do.
our
I'm
emotions.
53. I can attest to the fun zone of menopause and perimenopause, but
Yeah.
whatever.
But I mean, if you're a trained pilot, I'm sure you could still go fly.
You can still go flying.
But there are just kind of things that were just a little bit wacky. They had to push through some of those gender barriers. And then of course, part of it too is a lot of the women that did learn to fly in their teenage years or early 20s is because their family had a plane, their dad flew, and so they're flying just from one farm to another, or because with fuel being rationed between World War I and again in World War II, airplane fuel was never rationed, and so people would sometimes, if they had to go across country, they would fly instead of drive
Wow. Wow.
because they could get the fuel for it.
I love that. And
Um,
I love that that's kind of where you pick up with the character of
yeah,
this dialogue between her dad and her mom and her brother. And her dad quietly gives her support by not criticizing or discouraging her, so to speak. And she's like finagling because she's used up all this little extra money to be able to go up in this plane and have this experience. And I wanted to ask you as an author, because what I think you do beautifully, and I've read a number of your books that are set in different time zones and cultures. What I felt from reading this is that you had a beautiful way of creating the cadence in the conversation that was time stamped. And I don't know another way. I've been trying to think of another way to ask you this question, but it hit me that conversations at dinner or conversations at a store or conversations at church would change depending on what the culture had, where the culture was at. And I felt like when I would listen and as I was reading the book, I felt like I could hear the timestamp. Like I could
mhm,
hear the environment in which she was trying to have a conversation about things that if you and I were to talk about those same things today, we would
yeah,
talk about them in a different way because we live in 2024 and we've had
mhm,
different opportunities and experiences. How do you do that as an author to kind of imagine it in a way? Because it's based, here we're in the United States, both you and I are
mhm,
in the United States. So it's not like you're having to come up with language translation or anything like that. Culturally, you can feel that it's pre-World War II and then into the war and the
mhm.
way they conversed with each other. Does that question make any sense to you?
Oh yeah, and it's definitely important. I feel like dialogue is definitely um, something that brings the character to life. And so, as an author and anyone that's sort of like writing fiction, is like, this is kind of how I do. I try to just strip my dialogue of anything that's modern. So when I'm writing the first draft, I'm not adding in, just kind of modern terms or just the
Dude.
way we speak. Yeah. And then I go through a second time, and I've created a list of like what are some popular sayings in the 1940s, hot dog, you're cool.
Yeah,
And so then I try to sprinkle those in, but I do it by character. I'm like, well, Nancy's brother might say that, but Nancy might not say that. And
right.
so, but I don't, but you also try not to overuse it. Like you might do it like 3 times in the whole book. And it's actually probably less than what you think it is, but it's just enough to make you like feel like you are there, and it kind of a little bit of a reminder of the era you're in. And another thing that kind of helps, just when you're listing like a food choice or something they're wearing, that also just kind of keeps the reader grounded in that era without even realizing, I've only really added like 4 to 5 words a page as far as like
Mm.
historical things. But it just makes the whole atmosphere feel that way.
Yeah, I'm thinking like soda shop drinks that maybe we wouldn't
Mhm.
even know now, or like, I don't know how you
The
prepare
music,
the
what they're
music,
listening to
or
on the
yeah,
radio. Yeah.
the meal that they're having may sound more time stamped.
Yeah.
And I thanks for sharing that, because I do think that's something as a reader, unless you're an author, you don't really realize that that's why you're feeling infused
Mhm.
into the story, and in a different time, that you've
Yes.
kind of gone back in time in this case, to where you're having an experience with them. And and it's kind of refreshing. I think that's probably why I love World War II, just in general, stories and movies. And there's something about, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is that I feel like I miss and long for, that feels rooted in I don't know what it is, but like style and family and community
Mhm.
and country, and probably all the cliches that we say about World War II. What did you fall in love with that you didn't know before, because you've now worked on this project and other projects that helped you kind of
Mhm.
time travel?
I think what I didn't realize before is how everybody joined the war effort. And I know that was part of the kind of the propaganda actually that was going on from the US government, but it was obviously for a good cause. But, a lot of women went to work that had never worked outside the home before, because they had married young and had their children.
So
And now
Rosie the
they're,
Riveter and
yeah,
all of
now
it.
they're going to and now they're repairing planes or they're building planes. And so you have all these women that are now working, and developing these skills, and everybody just wanted to do something. They wanted to join the Red Cross. They wanted to, gather donations. They wanted, just to, sell the war bonds. And I remember my own grandmother, who was a young mom in Salt Lake during the war, and she would go around and knock on doors and try to raise money for the war bonds. And like everybody just went. And I don't know what the numbers are, but like the next 2 days after Pearl Harbor, hundreds of thousands enlisted. So it was kind of a cool thing just to see how everybody as a nation, because we don't get that a lot anymore.
Yes, that's what it is.
Everybody
That's what
just
it
came
is.
together for a
Yes,
cause, and obviously there's disagreements happening and different belief systems, but everybody was there to
united.
win that war. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what I am longing for, is that we felt it after September 11th.
Mhm.
And I think we see it in the stories of World War II, that there was this unification and this desire to help one another and collect tires. I mean, my favorite movie probably of all times, is It's a Wonderful Life. And
Yeah.
that story falls in through the World War II era as well. And you see that. You see where everyone's trying to work, and some people can't go to war, so they're staying at home doing other things. And this story really spotlights what women did to fill in gaps, but also paved the way for women in Vietnam. And your daughter, my mother-in-law, who is 91, so she lived through the Depression and through the
Wow.
war, she
Mhm.
got her pilot's license. And it's extraordinary to me that she's also amazing at crocheting and canning and sewing and baking. And
Mhm.
but she, during a time where no one was saying to her, there was no Instagram account giving her permission and inspiration to do
Yeah.
something like this. So you look at Jackie and you look at Nancy, they find each other. I think this is an
Mhm.
interesting fact, that sometimes as women, we're super great at supporting each other, and sometimes we're super great at triggering each other. And
Right.
we can sometimes do both, right? Like sometimes it's the person that triggers you that inspires you to keep trying. Do you want to talk a little bit about Jackie and Nancy and how they interact and help each other and trigger each other maybe a little bit?
Yeah, so Jackie Cochran, and Nancy Love, so they're definitely contemporaries. They're both flyers. Jackie was more like she would go do like the air races and stuff, and Nancy, worked for Intercity. She was kind of like a charter pilot. She would take charter flights around and tourists around. So they kind of grew. They kind of approached flying a little bit differently, but they both did want women to aid in World War II. And Jackie, her agenda was more, let's get us militarized and let's get us right into the Air Force. Let's have a women's, sector. And Nancy was more like, let's just do whatever they ask us to do. Let's say we're ready, we're available. And of course, Jackie had a lot of like high connections. Her husband, was a wealthy donor to government officials, and so she had a lot of connections. So she was pushing on her end, and she was told that, okay, this program's going to happen, but it's on hold for a while. And Jackie was upset, so she's like, I have to go do something. So she took a bunch of women with her. They went to England and they flew, transport planes there. And then meanwhile, Pearl Harbor happened, and the window just opened for Nancy. Nancy was in America. This window open for her for this program to start. And they're like, we need to start it now. We need to get a squad together now. And so it was announced through the Army Air Force, to that Nancy was going to direct this program. And that was like 2 days before Jackie flew back, and she found out what happened. And she was, of course, furious because she thought, this is my program. But both women had been working in separate channels so simultaneously. And it's so interesting how even in the book world, like I could be like talking to my publisher, we come up with this great book idea, and I write it, and I turn it in, and 2 months later, this book comes out that's like in the same era and kind of the same story. And it's just interesting how like the synergy of the universe like works through different people at the same time.
I used to get triggered by that because, and then I learned that it was like, I mean, if you're a person of faith, that God's sharing that message, and he's making sure a lot of people hear it.
Yeah.
And so, I've had that exact same experience, even just recently. And so I do love that you kind of flesh that dynamic out. I don't love when there's this assumption that as women, we aren't supportive of each other if we're highly motivated. I do think it's beautiful that you show how Nancy and Jackie are both working towards a similar end, but they have a different intensity and approach to it. And I think honestly, that's what we need in all organizations, structurally, politically, community-wise, in families. We need other women to support other women, but realize we're going to go about it differently. And I think it's sometimes like the Nancys of our lives, we're like, oh, you need to be a little bit more Spitfire. And then the Jackies of the world, you're like, can you just be a little more relaxed and accept with the pacing of how things are? And it's messy. It's messy. I guess that's what I want to talk to you about, is like, I think it's messy, but it's beautiful. And also that women are not a monolith. Like we're not just one thing or another. We're complex people. And so do you have anything else you want to say on that? Because I do think when we tell more women's stories and we keep elevating women's stories historically, where maybe we didn't teach it in school, or we don't have a monument to it, or we don't have even a place in the museums where we're spotlighting women's contributions, we're going to get layers, right? We're going to get different versions of women's impact.
Yeah. And I think if you overlook it, I really think that the Lord's hand was in what their jobs ended up being, because I feel like if Jackie had been in America when Pearl Harbor happened, then the program would have gone differently. But having her, so Jackie ended up being over the whole training program, which ended up being in Sweetwater, Texas, eventually. And Jackie was a perfect person to do that, because she was very good at like schmoozing the top person, but yet working with the pilots and getting them ready. And so she had to be that go-between. She always was in political hot, fire zone. And she knew when things had to stay quiet, okay, that's a complaint, but we're not going to complain about that. Or yes, this is an issue and this has to go to the top tier to get addressed. Like, so she was very good at like kind of the mastermind and handling that. Where Nancy she started out in Delaware at the Newcastle Air Base there. And she was just a flyer at heart. She wanted just to train on
the love of flying.
Yeah. And she basically felt like women can do anything. And in fact, Jackie had a plan where women would fly from like one air base to another, and then they would like take a break and another aviator would take it to the next air base. And Nancy's like, no, The women can fly it all the way through. And so, so Nancy having that point of view and then being over the actual ferrying squadrons was the best place for Nancy.
Well, I see that from my own daughter who's 20, right?
Mhm.
There's certain things in culture, in church culture, in the world that she won't even know that it wasn't always like this. And I
Yeah.
love that for her. But sometimes I also am like, hey girl, like there's still work to do, but we've come a ways,
Yes.
we do have, and I know there's days where I don't feel like change is happening fast enough. And some days I feel like I'm having whiplash because the
Mhm.
world's changing so fast. And I just want a bygone era of where we were all united and we were all Rosie the Riveter and we were all
Right.
clear that we were working together on something. What do you want your readers to take away from the most from this?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would just say that that change does take time, and we do need to be patient. But that doesn't mean that we need to give up. I mean, Nancy went through a lot. I mean, they lost over, I think it was 33 to 35 women died during whether it was training, and a lot of them were faulty airplanes. And then they had to pay for their own funerals. In fact, Jackie paid for quite a few of the funerals because they weren't considered militarized to get that kind of benefit. Um, but I feel like just overall, like just writing this book and learning more about these women is that it is the long game, and just appreciate the small moments along the way.
I love that takeaway because I think we all need that. We all need, to
Mhm.
me, that's the power of a book. I think a book and a story teach principles better than a sermon does or
Yeah.
a lecture. And like, if I can live a story in a book, then I
Mhm.
can see those principles play out in my life and it's inspirational in a different way. And so I really appreciate you as an author taking readers through a story that we need today. We need to
Yeah.
know that these women were there and that they can inspire us and our daughters and our granddaughters to keep showing up in the sphere of influences that we have. And maybe we're not all pilots and we don't love flying, but we all have different stewardships
Yeah.
that make us light up inside. And I think when a woman is passionate and lit up inside, there's not a lot they can't do. I think there's something about that woman's heart that is just like, once you feel something and you're passionate about it, it's hard to get us to stop trying.
Mhm.
And I think you've done that in your own career, but also in specifically the last few books that you've written have felt to me women that can help me in my own
Yeah.
discouragement.
Mhm. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Those very kind words. I mean, it helps me too because I just look up to these women, and it's so interesting to not just see what their accomplishments were, but find out what their failures are, because that's what they built their accomplishments on.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that we so often are fearful that the flaws of our souls are going to be obvious to
Mhm.
the world, and yet that's oftentimes the place where I can make the biggest offering.
Yeah.
It's that messy part of me, and I love that in a book you get to kind of unzip that part of
Yeah.
these characters, and you do such a beautiful job. Um, where's the best way to find Lady Flyer, and any last thoughts you have, Heather, that you want to share?
Sure. So where to find Lady Flyer? It's honestly wherever books are sold online. Desert Books, Siegel Book, Amazon, of course, Barnes and Noble, and Kobo. I did want to put a little plug in for the audio. It's narrated by Nancy Peterson, and she's done some
She's
amazing,
amazing. Yep,
yeah,
she's done a few of my
just
books. She's
beautiful
amazing.
work. And so I
Yeah.
was so excited when I found out she was able to fit in this book. So I'm really excited about that. But
Yeah,
I
she's
think
got a
this,
gentle, sweet heart. She really
yeah.
does a beautiful job narrating.
And okay, so I started listening to it, and I was like, and Nancy starts out as a young teenager in the book. She's like 13 years old in the first chapter. And Nancy is reading her as a young girl. I'm like, I'm gonna see if she ages her up. And I knew she would, but So then I skip like several chapters when she's an adult. I'm like, yes, she did it.
See the fun. This is why you have to listen to book chats, because you don't even, this is the stuff that, these are the little gems that you don't
Yeah.
know unless you're in the industry or you've gone through a process like this before. And I love that you gave Nancy a plug and a shout out. Shout out to you, Nancy. Hopefully someone will send this conversation to her so she knows of our mutual love for her. Well,
Yes.
thank you, Heather. Thank you for your years of creation and your willingness to do the research. I think it's such a beautiful gift when we get to learn about history in a different way than maybe we did in school, sitting in our desk bored,
Right.
trying to read this one layer of the story that was perpetuated in textbooks. There's so much out there, and I'm grateful that you've contributed this layer that we didn't know about and we didn't understand maybe. And I'm excited to see who it inspires to do their own flying in their life. And thank you for joining us. And Shadow Mountain Publishing, thank you for hosting this. And please share this with, if you have a pilot in your family, or you have a grandma that remembers stories from World War II, or a daughter that's feeling maybe a little stuck, that the world is not supporting her in her dreams. This is one of those kinds of conversations that help us get unstuck and keep moving forward, because Nancy and Jackie did it for us as well. So thanks for being with us, Heather, and thank you.
Thank you so much.